we've already talked a little bit about the very basics of testimony, which is know what it is you're talking about. So if you fake it, the lawmakers will know. If you go up there and start expressing platitudes about how important it is to have access and you don't reinforce that with your knowledge of the bill, the lawmakers will notice and they will tune out. These hearings go for hours, and they will tune out. And in particular tomorrow, if the number of people I think are going to be there show up, this hearing could go for 4 to 5 hours. So remember that the first goal is brevity, the second goal is cogency, and the third goal is accuracy. Now, I just made all three of those up, but at the same time, I think they're useful, so please do pay attention to them. Make sure your remarks are concise. You're only going to have 3 minutes. Make sure that you know the bills. So we've talked a lot about S.70 and H.179 today. I hope that is hammered into your head. That's the veteran bill. But there's another set of bills that we haven't talked a bit as much about, and you're going to want to know those bill names as well if you're testifying. And those bills are S.74 and H.173. That's one medical deverticalization bill. And then another bill is just H.176. That's another medical deverticalization bill. H.176 doesn't have a Senate complement, which means that it doesn't have a lot of support. So that's one of those bills we want to just keep an eye on. But H.173 and S.64 does something that Chops mentioned it earlier, folks have been asking about for a long time. Dating back to 2012, there's been medical cannabis legally in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And from about 2014 onward, there were medical cannabis dispensaries in the Commonwealth. What a lot of folks don't know, though, is that those medical dispensaries were actually vertically integrated operations, which means that they were cultivating, manufacturing and producing, and retailing under the same license. And they had to put $500,000 in escrow just to be able to apply for that license. So as you can imagine, that created a huge barrier to entry. And it was coupled with the fact, someone mentioned this earlier in the program, that no equity program of any kind existed for those medical licenses dating back to 2012. The people who wrote the medical law didn't create an equity program of any kind for ownership of those licenses. The DPH didn't create an equity program of any kind for those licenses when they were the steward of the program. And the CCC has yet to create any type of medical equity program for ownership of those licenses. Now, I can see why that is, because it's not really the regulator's imperative to create those equity programs. It is the lawmakers' imperative to create those equity programs as a basis in the statute, and then the regulators implement the statute. That is why tomorrow is so crucially important, because not only are folks going to be testifying about veterans' access to medical cards and adding PTSD and opioid use disorder to the list of qualifying conditions, but we're also going to be testifying about Bill S.64 and H.173. And those bills are the deverticalization of medical licenses. So it's doing something good. It's taking away that barrier that is vertical integration of medical licenses, but it doesn't do enough. So when you're testifying to lawmakers about a bill that doesn't do enough, it's a little different than when you're testifying in support of legislation. When you're testifying in support of legislation, you're doing two things tactically. You're giving lawmakers reason to support the bill, and you're making sure that bad faith, profit-driven attacks are not used to sabotage the bill. Ellen and Steve talked a lot about that in the context of H.179 and S.70. But we're talking about something entirely different in the context of S.64 and H.173. We're asking lawmakers to amend a proposal that's already been submitted. Now, the proposal that's been submitted is very short, and it says only that medical cannabis licenses are going to be deverticalized and that the Cannabis Commission shall create the following types of licenses, including, but not limited to, cultivation, retail, manufacturing. They didn't include delivery, which is a little strange to me. But in any event, it's because it's an old bill that's just been recycled and refiled. But the other thing is that as simple as that text is, it doesn't include anything to create a mandate that the Commission take into consideration those that were most disproportionately impacted by the drug war when creating those license classes. That's an abomination. That's an abdication and absolutely a dereliction of duty on behalf of our legislature, on behalf of the people who filed that bill. I know who you are, by the way, and you escape being named here only out of the goodness of my heart. So I know who wrote the bill. I know who submitted the bill. There should have been an equity provision. It was 2 years ago that this was first brought up. In fact, at the Cannabis Advisory Board last year, in the summer of 2020, it was discussed that there needed to be a 3 to 5 year equity priority period for medical licensing, which means someone submitted this bill again, even though they were there for that conversation when it was discussed that there needed to be a 3 to 5 year equity priority period. And they did it without a mention of equity. Now, I want to give our lawmakers the benefit of the doubt. And I think tomorrow when folks bring up this issue and when folks mention the importance of adding a 3 to 5 year priority period for equity applicants seeking deverticalized medical licenses, the lawmakers are going to listen. Where I don't ascribe that same good faith is to the people who push this without an equity provision. I'm disgusted. And the fact that those are some of the same people trying to oppose disabled veterans' access to medical cards because it might impact the profits of medical card providers, it takes a lot to disgust me and make me very angry. But that is one way to do it. And I hope those of you who are listening are fired up as well and want to show up tomorrow now, because I hope you're seeing the forces that are at play in our lawmaking arena. And that's partially why these testimony sessions are so important, because when you show up and testify and you're an authentic person doing so, it comes across to the committee. Even if you have pre-written remarks, even if you need to take some time to study the language and know what's going on, it comes across as authentic. You're not there because you're trying to cover for someone else's attempt to use our laws to make money. You're there because it matters to you. And so the more people that show up, the more authenticity you can express in that testimony, the more likely it is that this bill is going to pass. It's very hard to get a bill passed. But if what you heard today about veterans' access to medical cards, about the importance of an equity priority period in licensing of medical licenses, in licensing of medical applicants if those licenses are deverticalized, if either of those topics speaks to you, please fill out the form that's pinned in the comments, show up tomorrow. Activism at its core is defined by showing up in moments like this and changing history. Because if you don't show up, you can be sure that the people who are trying to make money by opposing these laws and sabotaging these proposals will show up. So one other piece of advice is, I know I like to get on a soapbox and talk about the principle, but I started this conversation by saying don't do that in your testimony. And it's also why I said don't follow what I'm doing, because I have a very unique style of public speaking. What you want to do when you're testifying tomorrow is 3 simple things. Tell the lawmakers why you're there and who you are. Tell the lawmakers what bills you're there to talk about, and then talk about what in those bills you support or what needs to be amended. If you can keep your testimony to those 3 things, you will leave an impression on the lawmakers. Now, one part that gives you room to expand is when you tie your personal story, which is the lead-in or the introduction, to the policy issue that you're going to be discussing. So for example, as a disabled medical cannabis patient, I would be talking about access to medical cards or the importance of the deverticalization from that perspective. You may have another perspective entirely, and it's important for the lawmakers to know that when you're testifying. And then the other important component of providing public testimony is stating your affiliation, stating any groups you may be involved with. That's a fundamental issue of disclosure that you should always do when testifying. And then to close it out, you always want to let lawmakers know that you'll be following up to send them further remarks, clarifying any questions they may have. And with that, that brings me to my last point, which is if you get questions from the lawmakers, be prepared to answer questions. Let me rephrase. Be prepared to answer questions from lawmakers, because it is very likely if you say something that catches their attention, they will ask you a question. And it's actually a very good sign when they do so, because it means that what you've said has impacted them. So really keep your eye out at the end of your testimony. Don't just shut off your camera and turn off your microphone and leave the session. Wait until the chairwoman, or the chairman in this case, says to you, there are no questions. And if you do get a question, don't answer something you don't understand. It is perfectly fine to say, I appreciate the question, I do not know the answer, I will follow up in writing with my thoughts. Do not guess, do not go off on a rambling platitude speech because they asked you a question, it won't be helpful. If you can't answer the question, say so. Likewise, if you can answer the question, do so in a way that relates to the legislation. They're asking you a question about the legislation. They're not asking you, sometimes they'll ask you about principle, but they want to know the answer to the question in the context of the legislation. So if they ask you what can be done to make this better, say this is what you can add to the bill to make it better.